Question that we're going to look at today is compare how poets present ideas about conflict in the named poem and one other from Power and Conflict. Just so that we can make sure that we're singing from the same hymn sheet, what's the question about? Alistair? The poets, good. I know it's going to get tedious having to keep doing it, but the more I do it, the more it will go in, which means that you've learnt it. Okay. If the question is going to be about the poets and what the poets do, you need to be able to name check. Okay? If you don't remember the name of the poet from your chosen poem, don't worry about it, panic, fret, or descend into a foamy pit of mess. Just call it the poet. Okay? But this one here, this is your focus. And we're dealing about choices. Okay? This part, present ideas. The present part is your clue. So you can present an idea with feathers, sparkles and bows, or you can present it with cake. Okay? Just listen. So the focus here is going to be conflict, but every poet is going to do that and explore that concept in a different way. That is your hook. That is what you're focusing on. Okay? So it's going to be the choices that the writer has made. Choices the writer has made to show you or to explore ideas about conflict. It may not be their ideas, it probably isn't going to be their ideas. But it's their way of almost giving you an investigation. Okay? Shooting the breeze, mulling over ideas, debating concepts, anything like that, that is what these writers are doing. And they happen to choose a poem to do that. Okay? Some other thing in terms of this that you need to consider about is the structure of the poem. So far, the poems that we've studied have all got very different structures, haven't they? They look differently on the page. So you've got Ozzy. What does that look like on the page? Any ideas? Alistair?
Just the one stanza and it's quite short.
Okay, it's one stanza. Any idea about how many lines? 14 lines. Therefore, it adopts the sonnet form. Okay? And it's quite important that you express it in that way. Okay? There are reasons why the adoption of the sonnet form is quite important, simply because a sonnet is there to express a deep emotion. So for Ozzy, the presentation of conflict, or the idea about conflict, is really quite ingrained, quite personal. It's quite sort of in, I can't think of what the word is. It's clearly thought through and really quite disturbed, simply because of the way the traveller is telling the story. Okay? In Prelude, what does Prelude look like on the page? It is an extract. It's an extract from a long, as part and parcel of a far longer autobiographical poem. Alistair?
It's much longer. It's still all one thing, though. It's still all one.
Okay, so it's called an extended poem. Simply because it's long, okay? But the reason why we only have one stanza is because of that constant turning over of the idea. A stanza break wouldn't be appropriate in this, Because the stanza break functions almost as a paragraph functions in a piece of work, but we don't ever use paragraphs when we deal with poetry, we deal with stanzas. It changes the focus, it shifts our particular discourse. Noah?
So would that be because it's sort of the unstoppable nature, the unstoppable momentum?
Yes, so the fact that the poem is unstopped by stanza breaks, which for this one would be really quite artificial and simply wouldn't work, reflects that unstoppable nature of the poem, of the nature in response to the boy. The boy cannot control nature, therefore the poet doesn't control the stanza break. That concept works beautifully, and that's really all that you would ever need to say about structure, because it's quite a thoughtful, quite a free thinking. You're a free spirit now. Okay? London? How's that structured? Again, it looks completely differently on the page. 4 very clear stanzas. Each stanza has a full stop almost at the end of the line, so they become relatively contained. We can see that there is a clear shift. Every time we get to a new stanza, he is changing the direction, the side of the coin he's focusing on. So he uses the structure to navigate the ideas that he's dealing with. Amelia?
I wasn't here when we did London. I don't think I have a copy of it.
Okay, I'll get you a copy. Okay, and then if we have a quick look at Poppies, how was Poppies? How is that structured? Good. Yeah, nature of the material. Remember the opening stanza? They are inconsistent stanza lengths. Okay? The first stanza is to do with what happens 3 days later, 3 days before armistice. The second stanza then propels us forward. And again, this is where you can start adopting the notion that there is a narrative. Okay? The story of the poem, not the story behind the poem. You're not expected to tell the story that's in the poem, but the idea that there is a narrative progression behind the words. And an understanding of that shows that you understand that there is maybe a narrative progression with conflict. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Some of the poems will just stagnate on a particular idea. Think about Charge the Light Brigade. An element when we look at exposure definitely remains, but because that idea has been stagnated, it allows us to access some of the meaning that's been embedded within the text. Okay? That's just structure. So that's another way that they've presented that in a completely different way. And we've already established that the 4 poems we've looked at so far deal with the concept, that narrative progression, in completely different ways. So that's something that you can use. Okay? This part here, back to the question, the word conflict is going to be your flexibility. So on Monday, when I asked you to mentally annotate and spending that time sitting still as much as you can and just thinking time without the pen on the paper is absolutely vital. Too many candidates will spend the first half, sometimes first page and a half, thinking as they're writing, because when the clock goes poetry, off they go. They don't actually start gaining marks, decent, proper marks, until they've stopped thinking and start writing properly. So that thinking time isn't really going to have any kind of quality, because you're mulling ideas over, you're kind of waffling around, you're walking about the park, and then when you've decided to sit down and focus, that's when the marks come. But then that's towards the end of the time for the paper, and you kind of run out of time, and then, oh, it's a bit of a car crash. So you need to think. You need to be earning marks on the first word you put down. If you don't think, you won't be earning those marks until at least your second paragraph. Okay? So that's why that thinking and that planning time is absolutely vital, because you are allowing yourself that scope to just breathe and therefore get those ideas sorted out so that you can start earning. Okay? But the flexibility means you need to start being thoughtful. What does it mean? Your grade 1ers are going to start saying, well, conflict means fighting, conflict means war. Yes, it does, but it means an awful lot more than that. Okay? So this bit, you need to think. But you need to think beyond the obvious. You need to think into, basically, the blue sky. And it's that whole cliche blue sky thinking, out of the box, things like that. But it's going beyond the obvious. Start stretching the concept. Never break the question, ever. Because you'll be capped at level 2, which is half marks. No matter how amazing your essay is, if you break the rule of the question, you can only get half marks. Wisdom?
What do you mean by like bricks and rules?
So, for example, and you've got to work really hard to break the rule of the question, but it's happened in the past. If the question is about conflict, and you talk about going buying shoes, not really answering the question. Or if it's about conflict, and you start talking about how everything's all very happy and lovely, and poppies are really pretty, and you really like the colour yellow, and that's nice. No. Okay? Or that kamikaze is sad, but he really enjoys fishing because he can see the fish in the water below his aircraft. No. Okay? You've got to work hard to do that. What that also will do is that ties in with what we call the context. The context is not your potted history. The context is thinking around the idea. Okay? Noah?
The examiner, in their mind, before they mark it, will they sort of have an idea as how...
We are given by the exam board what's called indicative content. So the examiner, who's a lovely lady called Sarah, writes it with an idea of what she would expect a typical bog standard 16-year-old to be able to refer to. Okay? And the idea is that they're not sort of quite not simple bog standard ideas. So some of them are really quite challenging, but it gives the scope of ability of what we would expect a typical 16-year-old to be able to produce. That is the indicative content. That is not a strict content. So if what you've written isn't on that list, that's fine. So long as you've justified it and the examiner can see where the idea has come from and they go, actually, yeah, fair play, that works, it's yours.
And also, are we going to do kamikaze?
Yeah, we have to do all of them.
Oh.
Don't worry.
I like the word.
That's coming. So, this one here, listen please, this one here is also absolutely vital, as is that one. If you do not refer to the named poem, you have broken the rule of the question. So the named poem will be printed in the paper. It will say, for example, compare how poets present the ideas about conflict in Ozymandias and one other poem for the power and conflict cluster. Okay? If you don't talk about that named poem and you wander off and talk about My Last Duchess, you've broken the rule of the question. Okay? So the comparative is absolutely vital. It is a significant assessment objective. It's AO4 for GCSE and you are marked on that first. So you need to make sure you get that in. Okay? So, with all of that in mind then, this one is down to you. Okay? So you're given the named poem. Go with it. Deal with it. It isn't necessarily going to be one that you want. Tough. This one is open choice. How many poems from the cluster do you choose?
One.
If you choose more than one, what's happened? Oh, as if by magic you can tune in. Now, this choice here is both informed by the theme and will inform the theme. Okay? From the examiner's report and part and parcel of what we do when we start revising this, hopefully February time, is that you should be able to see, right, conflict. Okay, I've got 5 poems I can deal with it. Now, which one of those poems can I use with my named one, even if your named one isn't part of that? So if we choose, for example, poppies to show conflict, think about it. Which other one could you use? Okay, well, I'm going to choose London. So I'm going to choose and do a comparison between poppies and London. Not your most obvious comparison, but that's fine. But the connection, the interpretation, the idea that you want to use to access those two, is going to be unique to you. Some of them may be fairly obvious. That's absolutely fine. My biggest advice, if you take nothing away from this session, is that this choice here is the make or break for that question. It is absolutely vital. It will come down to your revision. It will come down to the connections that we make whenever we go into the poems. Okay? If you're going to do a comparison between Poppies and London, fine. It can work, but you need to have the confidence in yourself that you can make it work quickly and effectively. If you're thinking, I'm going to really push it, I'm going to really try it, I'm going to take a risk, and it doesn't pay off, you don't get a chance to redo it. Yes, take the risk, but make sure it's calculated. Make sure you can get the poems to work. Poppies in London can work, but you need to think about it and be ready to think about that. If you are spending a long time shoehorning in Poppies in London, you need to choose a different one. Okay? Your thinking time shouldn't start eating into your writing time. It should be there to give you a chance to get your ideas in order. Noah?
The best thing to do would be to read the poem that you're given, and then according to the question, get an idea which is good, and then pick the other poem to fit the idea.
Yes, yeah, go with the idea first. So you don't spend a huge amount of time reading the poem, you just remind yourself of it, okay? And then you go, oh yes, definitely, I'm definitely going to do London, because that's brilliant. And then you will find that it becomes really quite organic and quite frantic with where you can make your notes going, sort of appearing. You won't have London in front of you, you won't have your chosen poem, so you need to know it in your head well enough that that's the combination that you can use. We will be doing combination work, okay, so you can pick it out. Yeah, we won't be doing combination essays, we might be doing combination paragraphs. And if we don't get time to do that, then that's a potential revision task that you can do, definitely. Amelia?
Could we contrast the poems as well?
Well, if you think about Poppies doesn't deal with conflict in the same way that London does. And again, it ties into the fact that this is a different way of presenting an idea that's the same way. If you think about the way that you wear your uniform, you all wear the same uniform, but you wear it in very different ways. Okay? Or the way that your hair is done. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ways your hair is worn. You've all got hair, for girls that is, okay? But you are choosing 7 now to do, thank you Jasmine, to wear it in a different way. So that's the meat of your comparison. Okay, similarities are really dull, and you'll get bored. The difficulty that we have is that too many candidates don't listen when they're being spoken to, but they also focus just on the similarities because they think it's easy. Similarities don't give you a huge amount of detail, especially for language paper 2. Go with the conflict, that's where the meat is. That's what's really interesting, because you can talk about agendas, you can talk about the narrative progression, you can talk about the idea of Poppies and how that's really interesting in conflict, and then London, Blake, different time frame, and he's got this idea of conflict. Is he in conflict? Is he dealing with conflict? Is it the result of conflict? Anything. Yeah? Angus?
So is this question 45 minutes?
Yes.
So you need to write like 2 pages?
2 pages, 2.5, depending on A, how big, and B, how fast you can write. But you need thinking time. If you are writing for 45 minutes, you haven't thought.
But with things like this, you don't need to write a conclusion. You sort of just...
Your introduction and conclusion are 3 lines each.
Do you need an introduction? Would you lose marks if you didn't have it?
No, but they are useful. But I'm going to limit you to 3 lines.
Should you introduce the other poem you're going to do in your introduction?
Yes, that's line 2. So line 1 is the name poem.
Yeah.
Line 2 is your chosen poem. Line 3 is how you're going to put them together. That's it. Okay? Too many times I've seen instructions that are half a page long. You don't tend to earn marks in an introduction because all you're doing is laying the ground. If you can do that in 3 lines, you've then got the rest of your response and the rest of your time to go to town. Okay?